Hi everyone, it is Madison here. I apologize for not being there a couple of days ago when class was actually happening. I was quite ill. I ended up having to go to the emergency room right after I had message tests, and that's why I was unable to respond and kind of left you guys hanging. So I apologize, but here I am with my presentation. It might be a little out of sync just because I had planned to have such a discussion with you all during it. But that discussion will be had in our forum discussion that I will monitor as soon as I can get this up, which will hopefully be today, Sunday, March, I don't know the date, Sunday. All right. So my topic, my area that I'm going to be discussing for this class are the readings on epidemics and arguments. So that is the title of my presentation. So the readings that I chose for this week for my lesson were the introduction by Wald from the book entitled Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative, as well as the article by Segal, Illness as Argumentation. Those are the two that I'm focusing on. They're not directly related, but I do feel like they were both very interesting to me and will be of a lot of value to you all to focus on this week. So my objectives for this lesson, by the end of this lesson, the class will be able to understand the outbreak narrative concept and be able to identify it using examples of past epidemics. Identify who the key players are in developing a global narrative for illness and disease. Understand the consequences of the outbreak narrative and how it relates to stereotyping and prejudice. And relate Aristotle's concepts of kairos and pisteus to contestable medical complaints. So first we will focus on Wald's reading, Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative from that book. So I wanted to start with this quote by Wald on page 2. Communicable disease compels attention for scientists and the lay public alike, not only because of the devastation it can cause, but also because the circulation of microbes materializes into the transmission of ideas. So next, I was going to get you to watch a video by NBC News entitled Inside an Ebola Treatment Center, and answer some questions to go along with it. I will be posting the link to this video in the forum if you want to have a look at it. I also will be posting my questions that I wanted to ask you all. So pretty much this is without giving too much away, it is a video that was a news story when the Ebola outbreak was happening a couple of years ago. And things I want you to consider and try to answer for this would be, what narrative is this news story trying to tell? What rhetorical language is being used to portray this narrative? And what visuals and imagery are being used to support this narrative? So Wald focuses a lot on the idea of an outbreak narrative. Following the introduction of HIV in the mid-1980s, accounts of new diseases began to appear with increasing frequency in scientific publications and the mainstream media worldwide. These accounts put the vocabulary of disease outbreaks into circulation and introduced the concept of emerging infections. According to Wald, the repetition of particular phrases, images, and storylines produced a formula that was amplified by the extended presence of these themes in popular films and novels of the time. All of these outbreak narratives have the element of a traditional story plot. So a setting, a conflict, a protagonist and or hero, and an antagonist, etc. So there's lots of similarities between these narratives that come from epidemics and your traditional story that you would see on film or in a book. So we ask, who creates these outbreak narratives? Not just one person. Not one person starts a whole narrative surrounding an illness, although kind of they do when that person falls ill. However, according to Wald, epidemiologists who are trying to find the source and the means and the routes of transmission for an illness or an epidemic, journalists and the media who are trying to inform the public of danger and perhaps put a little fear into them, medical researchers who are trying to find a cure and a vaccine. All of these people are kind of the key players in the development of an outbreak narrative, which is further reinforced by representation in movies, films, book, and other cultural artifacts. So as Wald points out, an epidemic that had a profound effect on the development of outbreak narratives was HIV and AIDS in the 80s and 90s. But what do you all think was the outbreak narrative of this illness or these illnesses? In the forum, I'm going to ask if you want to try and identify what you think are the elements listed here on the slide of the narrative of the HIV/AIDS outbreak that happened in the late 80s and early 90s. So what was the setting? Who or what were the protagonists? Who were the antagonists? What was the overall plot? What was the resolution of this narrative? And if so, do you think that there were or are any consequences to the narrative that came with these illnesses at the time? And do these consequences still have an effect to this day? So I will leave those questions and those points for you in the forum after for you to take a look at and try to come to your own conclusions on that. I'd love to hear what you all have to think about that. So these narratives just don't come and go without having some sort of a consequence. Outbreak narratives have consequences. As they disseminate information, they affect survival rates and contagion routes. They promote or mitigate the stigmatizing of individuals, groups, populations, locations, and lifestyles. They change economies. They influence how both scientists and the lay public, as Wald describes, understand the nature and consequences of infection, how they imagine the threat, and why they react so fearfully to some outbreaks and not others. A consequence of the outbreak narrative is also, as Wald refers to, a super spreader, which is a term used multiple times throughout this chapter. A super spreader would be a person or the people who become known for spreading the disease. So for example, the SARS example that's in the reading, there was one or a few people who became victims of that illness and then began to spread it just by living their basic lives. They became known kind of as the key players in that narrative and are the super spreaders. So this idea turns victims of the illness into agents of the illness. Whether or not this is fairly, I'm not sure, but you can discuss that again in the forum. So for further exploring the idea of victims of the illness becoming an agent, a carrier, the bad guy in an outbreak narrative, This is a video that I would like you all to watch. I will post the link in the forum as well, which is a trailer for an upcoming film called The Cure, which stars Ellen Page, our hometown hero. After watching this film, and I'll give you a minute, you can just pause and continue once you've finished watching it. I would like you to think about an example where this type of social demonizing, spoiler, happened in a real life response to an outbreak narrative. So can you think of a time or an example of when the victims of an illness became portrayed as the antagonists, let's say, in the outbreak narrative? Another consequence of outbreak narratives is what Alan Kraut first called medicalized nativism, or society's justification of mistreating and stigmatizing groups or cultures because of their association with communicable disease. So when a certain epidemic happens that then becomes tied to a certain culture's rituals, their way of life, Kraut is arguing that we then justify being prejudiced and our actions against that culture because we state that there is justification because the illness is coming from there. So they must be doing something wrong. An example of this would be the primitive farms of Guangzhou. I don't know how to pronounce that, I apologize. But that Wald focuses on in this reading, which is apparently where SARS first stemmed from. So this idea of medicalized nativism often hides or distracts from the real problem going on, and by placing the blame elsewhere. So for example, when the real problem might be poverty and the conditions that we have created for people, it becomes, oh, it's their way of life that has created this illness, so it's their fault. And so this is a big consequence as well that comes with the outbreak narratives that we tell. So now I'll give you a scenario. Let's say your friend just returned from a trip and came right from the airport to your house to see you. Would you, and try to be honest, would you consciously think about the amount of people, places, items your friend had interacted with before you gave them a hug? Some of you might say, yeah, and that's totally okay if you're aware of germs. I commend you. But me, honestly, I wouldn't. I would just give them a hug. I wouldn't think about the airports that they've gone through, the people, the taxis. That's just not the first thing that would come to my mind. However, let's say there's a new epidemic of an incurable virus that can be transmitted by touch. Would you be more aware of it? Of course you would. Everyone would be. We become almost alienated from each other when something like that is going around. The closest thing I can think of to that recently would be Ebola, because of the severity of it and kind of the narrative that if you got it, you were dead. So I know in Canada it wasn't as intense. It wasn't anything compared to what it was like elsewhere in the world, but it did kind of make everyone a little bit more on edge, I think. And so this is because, according to Wald, super spreaders and the worldwide interdependence, so interacting with everyone all the time, turn the simplest interactions into potentially fatal on a global scale. One simple door handle opening might then spread an illness that causes death. So you may recognize the masks in the photo on the screen as SARS masks, or the protective masks that you'd wear in a hospital that were commonly worn in many Asian countries and still are, I think, during the SARS outbreak. But according to Wald, the masks represent much more than a simple protection against germs. They depict human beings' futile efforts to defend themselves against the threat of illness in the daily interactions made globally by contemporary transportation and commerce. People are no longer people, they are potential disease carriers. And I'll end with the quote, "The physiological metamorphosis of human carriers turns them into representational figures of the fact, the danger, and the possibilities of human interdependence in a shrinking world." So again, I hope that you take the time to watch those couple of videos and consider the questions on this reading that I'm going to be posting in the forum. And now let us move on to my second section of this lesson, which would be Illness as Argumentation by Judy Segal. So I'll try to say this correctly because I'm not good at this long word. Illness as Argumentation, a prolegomenon. Let's go with that. To the Rhetorical Study of Contestable Complaints is the full article title. So in her article, Illness as Argumentation, a prolegomenon, if I'm saying that wrong, please leave it in the forum comments, to the Rhetorical Study of Contestable Complaints, Segal explores the question, how do patients convince physicians that they are ill and in need of care? And conversely, how do physicians convince patients when the need arises that they are well and not good candidates for medical interventions? So another question that I'd like you to consider and maybe write a little anecdote or story in the forum. Have you ever had to convince a healthcare professional of your symptoms or illness? So have you ever gone to the doctor or the hospital and had to kind of plead your case for that you are experiencing some sort of illness and not have them believe you, so you really, or seem very skeptical, so you have to convince them? And if you have had that experience, what do you think made them believe you, if they did? If you think that they believed you at all, or if you think they were just humoring you? So Segal discusses the topic or the idea of types of patients. So I'll give you an example. A 50-year-old male visits the doctor once a month complaining of different symptoms, aches, pains, dizziness, etc. during each visit. He rarely takes the doctor's advice, but is convinced he has something wrong with him. And let's go for our second patient. A 28-year-old female visits the doctor complaining of a constant headache. This is her first visit in almost a year, and she had to be convinced to come. So how would you describe these two types of patients? Patient one, the 50-year-old male who visits the doctor once a month, always has different complaints. He never really does any of the things the doctor advises him, but he swears there's something going on with him. And then the 28-year-old female who visits the doctor not very often at all, but is complaining now of just having this constant kind of dull headache. What words, how would you describe these types of patients or this patient? And what patient do you think the doctor would take more seriously, and why? So I will let you answer those as well in the forum, but just things for you to think about. So according to Segal, types of patients come especially into play in relation, For example, to patients with the persistent, often vague, and usually invisible complaints associated with illnesses such as fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and I wanted to add in now mental illness. There's the example that started with migraines. So William Henry Day, in his work Headaches, Their Nature, Causes, and Treatment, invented the idea of the migraine personality. So the person who cannot cope with the ups and downs of daily life, they're untrustworthy, they're overly complaining, angry. Then there's the bad apple type of patients, so a hypochondriac or a malingerer, someone who creates symptoms to get attention. Really different types of patients can affect their credibility. It's generalizing and stereotyping that is happening in the medical industry, and really just because we're human, and that's kind of what happens. If you were a doctor and you saw however many patients each day, I think that it would be easy to kind of mentally categorize them, which then could affect how you treated them, which, as Segal points out, is definitely an issue. So these examples, as I mentioned above, represent types of patients. This is an element of medical literature and practice, and as I said, it is often used to determine whether or not to take a patient seriously. So a factor or an element that comes with diagnosing types of patients are the idea of contestable complaints. So complaints that are not objectively verifiable and rely on some form of argument to be taken seriously. So something that cannot be easily proven, that you need to prove, essentially. An example or some examples of illnesses that merit contestable complaints would be depression, anxiety, really any type of mental illness, headaches, muscle aches, heart palpitations, anything that your doctor can't see immediately, can't feel immediately, doesn't show right up on your blood work, something that really you need to prove to them is going on with you. So Segal, she believes that diagnosis and treatment shouldn't be based on, or the choice whether or not to believe someone shouldn't be based on the type of patient, but should be based on the type of argument that the patient is making. So she proposes a new framework for evaluating the complaints of patients, which would be a rhetorical approach to physician-patient interaction, proposing that physicians use kairos, contingency, and pisteus, or ethos, pathos, and logos, so the character of a patient, the emotional appeal, and the logical modes of persuasion of the arguments to base their diagnosis and their conclusion, rather than generalizing the type of patient. So kairos, or the right, critical, or opportune moment. So Segal argues that medicine is grounded and responsive to time, place, and situation. As time changes, things change. For example, homosexuality was once a medical illness, which has now become declassified as a medical condition as times have changed and we have become more knowledgeable and smartened up. And then social anxiety disorder, which was never a thing, now becomes classified as a medical condition. Does anyone else have another example of this type of change that's happened over time in medicine. Write it in the forum. So Segal's argument is that physicians should attempt to view symptoms outside of the current trends in medicine, which can easily influence an opinion or a decision, because we can be easily influenced and persuaded by the beliefs of the time. So if a patient comes in complaining of something that you've just read a million books about because it's the hot topic of the time, and all the books say, oh, well, that's not a real illness, don't believe them. Don't use that as your overall diagnosis. Like, listen to the patient first, and kind of try to forget about the hot trends of the moment and what is going on in the political climate, everything outside of just the argument of your patient. So as I've just kind of stated, Segal suggests that a patient's argument should be evaluated or judged based on their persuasiveness and their methods of persuasion. So Segal, as she says, illness can be understood as a conclusion drawn from a series of arguments that can be judged on their merits without moralizing elements such as personal weakness, oversensitivity, neuroticism, delusion, etc. Segal suggests that a patient's complaints should be evaluated on their use of logical and emotional appeals in their argument and their character, that all of these different elements work together to create persuasive arguments. And so where an argument might be weak in logos, it might gain its strength back in a strong emotional appeal. Or, for example, a claim that is weak in logos, so logic might be rehabilitated when the speaker shows him or herself to be trustworthy, the ethos, or composed, so the pathos. But we need to ask the question, why? Why would evaluating a patient's complaints based on the argument itself instead of the patient or the type of patient benefit both the doctor and patient? So according to Segal, a rhetorical view puts the idea of the patient kinds or types to one side and foregrounds instead the question of the strengths of arguments. Then perhaps a person who reports chronic daily migraines is not, in the first instance, a difficult patient, but rather a patient who is suffering. The more doctors stereotype patients, the more likely they are to actually miss something. And as somebody who frequents the doctor with many different complaints myself, last week for example, I know that I would appreciate being listened to on the merits of my argument instead of being placed in the category of a hypochondriac. So if you have any questions or thoughts on this lesson, this presentation, I would love to hear them in the forum. Again, I apologize for not being able to do this live with you all. I was actually really looking forward to having a discussion and hearing your feedback on everything, but I guess this will have to do for now. So again, I will post those questions in the forum once I figure out where it is and how to upload this for you guys. And yeah, have a great night and don't get sick.